Hey everyone, my name is Rooster and welcome back to Mechabellum. In today's video I want to tackle a long requested one, which is about unit pairs. So if you've got a certain unit, then what goes well with it? I'll be going over all of the units, so it's going to be a longer one, and down below you'll be able to find the timestamps in case you want to go back and look at a certain unit. I won't be going over crawlers and fangs because chaff is always important, so I think there's no point in me putting crawlers and fangs next to every unit because you will always want them on your board. That being said, I'm going to be giving you guys options, so be wary. My list that I'm giving you is not a tier list. I am not giving you what is the very best. I'm just giving you guys, these are all things that could work. You just have to kind of pick and choose depending on the game. Try things out, see what you prefer. Alright, let's start with our very first unit, which is going to be the Hound. So here we are. The Hound. Now what do I recommend that you pair it with? The Hound is a chaff clear unit, so you're obviously going to want to pair it with something like DPS and maybe sometimes a tankier unit because it's not the most tanky either and it can use some protection. So that's why you will see things like Saber plus Phoenix, so you have some tankiness with the Saber and some DPS and anti-air with the Phoenix. You will see giants, tanky giants, things like Raiden, Overlord, Fortress, Abyss, and then finally I'm going to mention something like Hacker Mustang, which can often use a little bit of extra chaff clear because Mustangs alone are not always enough, and that's why I would put it there. That is the Hound. Now let's move over to the next. Here we are, the newest unit in the roster, the Void Eye. The Void Eye is a DPS unit, so you're going to want to pair it with something that can chaff clear. It is on the tankier side of things, so it might not always need a frontliner, but it can be nice. I'm going to be putting Spider here, obviously. It's chaff clear and a little bit lower range than the Void Eye, so it sits nicely in front of it. I'm going to pair it with something like a Wraith, kind of a similar story. And I'm going to be mentioning Badger. Badger is mostly if you want to go aerial Void Eye. I don't think it's good to have both of them sit on the ground because they are similarly sized units with 3 in the pack, so that means they have the same counters, especially if both of them are on the ground. But yeah, these ones should be decent to choose from. Let's move on. Alright, and immediately here we're going to be tackling one of the units with the most pairings, which is the Arclight. This makes sense. It is a chaff clear unit, it is a starter unit, so it's easy to get into, and you will often see yourself kind of building some Arclights in your composition. Now what do you want to pair it with? You will want to pair it with DPS, anti-air, and maybe something tanky. So that's why you see comps like, let's say the first one, Marksman, Storm, and Mustang. Marksman for that DPS and anti-air, Stormcaller for a little bit of extra DPS, and then Mustang will often get paired with Arclight because of the weaknesses that both units have chaff clear wise. Arclight is good into things like crawlers, Mustang isn't. But Arclight isn't good into loose formation crawler and shielded fang, while Mustang is. So you will often see them paired together to kind of make up for their chaff clear shortcomings. Other options, you can of course go something like Phoenix instead of Marksman. You can go for a bigger tank like Fortress with Mustang. You can go into the air units like the Overlords and the Raidens that you see in option 6. There's another comp in there as well that utilizes Mustang, which is going to be a Scorpion Mustang board, which obviously might need some additional chaff clear. And then in the second row of options, you will find, or column rather, you will see Stormcaller Melter, obviously a bigger DPS option there, a giant. You will see Sandworm. This might need some anti-air as well, but Arcworm is a very strong comp. You'll just need to kind of add like Marksman or Phoenix to it. A Factory, you can see sometimes it needs some chaff clear, but it can deal with everything else. And then some other tanky options with Mustang. We have Sabertooth Mustang and we have Hacker Mustang. Again, same reason here. You make up for the shortcomings of the Mustangs. Let's move on. Marksman. The cheap DPS option that we have alongside Void Eye. What do you want to pair it with? Well, you will see some familiar combinations here where you see Arclight, Storm, Mustang for kind of a cheap option, right? You need some chaff clear and maybe you need some bonus DPS because Marksman doesn't have the most until it's like really late game and fully scaled. You can pair it with something like Spider, which tanks for it nicely and adds the chaff clear component it needs. You can pair it with something like Sledgehammers and Mustang. Same reason here, you have some frontline and you also kind of mix mid-tier chaff clear options to create an okay chaff clear. And then obviously the Vulcan, which even has that best partner tech so that you can spawn Marksman. That's it for the Marksman. Let's move on to the next. And here we're getting into our first 200 cost units, the Mustangs. You see them getting added to a lot of the combinations here because it will often be kind of supplementary chaff clear, and it is the only unit that really is extremely solid against things like late Wasps. So yeah, it's a unit that you will often see, but if you really want it to be a core component of your board, a carry, then you will want to pair it with something that can provide DPS and provide some tankiness. So here, Fortress and Scorpion make a lot of sense. Hacker can kind of provide the same thing because it has access to Barrier. War Factory, obviously, big chunky unit, so that'll do well. We've got Melters, which can do the same thing. Sabers, Sandworms, Steelballs. I mean, you kind of see the trend, right? Where you want something that is a nice frontline unit for the Mustangs to be safe. And here we have the Sledgehammers. Some of your favorite units, I know. Lots of people really, really love the tanks. And what do you want to pair them with? Well, a classic combination would be something like Marksman and Storm. Other options are obviously going to be the bigger DPS options, like Melters, like Overlords, like Abyss, or the air variant of Marksman, the Phoenix. You might want to pair these with some additional chaff clear, so adding Arclights, Mustang, Storms is often going to be a good idea, because while they can chaff clear, they do have some weaknesses similar to the Arclight against loose formation and shielded fang, and yeah, that's why you will often need to kind of add some bonus chaff clear to help them out if that becomes an issue. Alright, next up, we've got Storms. Now, Storms are an interesting one. They're mostly going to be useful in longer range scenarios, and what they provide is solid DPS, especially against bigger targets, but they can also become chaff clear with the addition of something like Incendiary Bomb. So, bit of a weird one, and you will see that a lot of the comps are kind of already self-sufficient in this list, like, let's say, Arclight Melter, or Vulcan Marksman, or Vulcan Phoenix, but they can often benefit from what Stormcaller provides, which is kind of that long-range, kind of consistent DPS element. So yeah, you will see here a bunch of already existing comps: Arclight Marksman, Sledgehammer Phoenix, Sledgehammer Marksman, Arclight Melter, and then the Vulcan compositions with the Marksman and the Phoenix all gel really well with this particular unit. And then we've got the Steelballs, which are trickier to make use of. They've got a lot of counters in this game, so they're kind of hard to pull off, but some units that they do go well with is the classic Ball Stang pairing in option 1. Of course, the Wraith has been an addition in the game for some time and really goes well with it, and that's a comp that you actually see being played even up to the very high MMRs. And then a final mention to Typhoon. It's a bit risky because both of those units obviously get countered by Scorpion, but it is something that you used to see and it still makes some sense, right? You want to pair this with chaff clear, obviously. And now we're moving into, again, a chaff clear unit, which will have a lot of potential pairings. It's going to need DPS. Apart from that, it's pretty all-encompassing. It's a very solid chaff clear unit. It doesn't really need help because of things like HE. And it's also really nice and tanky. So things that go well together with it is the classic Phoenix pairing. You can try Marksman, you can try Melter, you can play it with Sabers, but then you'll often need to add the Mustang for that anti-air component. Void Eyes could work. Scorp, Stang could benefit the same way that you would see that with the Arclight, right? The Spider can help out with the chaff clear if necessary. And then we've got a bunch of bigger air DPS options like Overlord, Raiden, and Abyss. Moving on to a DPS option at the 200 cost, the Sabertooth. Now, this is a nice DPS unit. It's pretty tanky as well. The one thing it lacks is chaff clear and something that shoots up. So the pairings here will be something like Arclight Mustang, a Spider Mustang, sometimes even Wraith if you're on the line, and something like Hound Phoenix can also work. Moving on to the Rhino. Now this is not an easy unit to play, and yeah, it doesn't have a very important role on the battlefield often. But if you want to give it a go, then you would have to pair it with something that can provide anti-air and maybe a little bit of bonus chaff clear. So the options here will obviously be something like Mustang, something like Hound Phoenix, something like even Wasp sometimes. And then I will mention Carry Fang specifically, but it has to be Carry Fang, so I added the little symbols for mech rage and range on those, because you will need to click those if you want to try to somehow play that meme comp. And then we move on to the Hacker. Some of your favorite units, some of your most hated units, but either way, what do you play it with? Well, it's at heart a DPS unit. So it needs some chaff clear to help it out. And that's why a lot of these options will be things like Hound, and then obviously something that can provide anti-air, so Mustang. Stormcallers I put in here because this unit struggles against shields, so having some shield break on the board can be very useful, and that's what Stormcaller provides. So that's why you will see it added here as well. You can play something like Sledgehammer, Mustang, Storm. You can play the Fire Badgers with the Mustangs and the Storms. You can play Arclights with Mustang and Storms. And then finally, I will mention the Carry Fang option as well. This is a bit memey, but it can work. And then we move on to Wasp, specifically here Wasp Carry, because Wasps also have a core role as a chaff unit, much like Crawlers and Fangs. And so I don't want to talk about their chaff role, because then I could add them to any of these unit combinations. I'm talking specifically here about Carry Wasp. So what do you want to pair it with? Well, something tanky that can make sure that it doesn't get hit by things like Mustang, and something that can ideally chaff clear for it. So the options here are going to be Worm and Wraith, or something like Rhino. And now we've arrived at one of the best units in the game, the Phoenix. It is an air DPS unit, so it needs ideally some frontline and some chaff clear, which will get provided by comps like Spiders, Arclight Mustang, Fire Badgers, Sledgehammer Mustang, Vulcan, Arclight Storm, Hound Rhino, Wraith, or even Arc Worm. Lots and lots of options, but yeah, it's a strong one, so there's lots of comps that this can be used in. And this brings us to an awkward one, the Phantom, another 200 cost air unit, but this time it's a DPS tank. That's lower range. It's pretty hard to make this work. I added chaff clear options because, again, it is on the DPS side of things. So Fire Badger, Hound, Vulcan all make sense. These are also units that have access to fire usually, so they can work together with the sticky oil bomb on defense, for instance. But yeah, it's a weird one. Phantoms rarely have a core role. They will often be used from drops as an additional tank, but it's hard to make this unit be a core component of your board. And so I don't want to, yeah, give you guys the wrong idea here about the use of this unit. Then we have the Wraith. Now this is a pretty versatile unit, at least on the front lines, a very, very good chaff clear. And, well, that immediately tells you what it needs. It ideally needs some DPS. And that'll be provided by things like Steelball, Sabers, a Sledgehammer, and Abyss can also pair with it well. Void Eye, you can go for the Worms and the Wasps. And you can go for, of course, the Phoenix. All of these are solid options. And, yeah, I wouldn't mind playing almost any of these. And then we get into the ground-based 300 cost unit, the Scorpion. It's a nice DPS unit. It's a pretty good tank as well, so it will often need something like chaff clear and anti-air to pair with it. And that's why Scorp Stang is a classic, but also you can try and play it with things like Arclight, Storm, and Marksman, specifically with Siege mode. You can also try and pair it with Fire Badger Phoenix or Spider Phoenix if your opponent has a lot of mid-sized units, or even something like Hound Phoenix. And then we get into the giants. First up, the chaff clear giant, the Vulcan. This needs some DPS, and it will find that in the Marksman and the Storms, the Phoenix and the Storms, the other giant here, the Melter, or something like an Overlord. As for the Melter, it is the flip side of the Vulcan. It is a DPS giant, so it needs some chaff clear. The pairings will reflect that. You will find things like Arclight Storm, Sledgehammer Mustang, Fire Badger, Spiders, Vulcan of course, or something like Hound. We then have kind of the Defender giant, the protective giant, the Fortress, able to provide that barrier to units. It also has good DPS, but what it doesn't really have is chaff clear, and so the core pairings will reflect that with Arclight Mustang, Hound Phoenix, Fire Badger Phoenix, Sledgehammer Phoenix, or again something like the Carry Fang build if you're feeling spicy. As for the Sandworm, it doesn't have that many pairings. It can fit onto a lot of boards, but here I'm talking about specifically kind of carry Sandworm boards where the worm is an integral part of the composition. And then you'll need some chaff clear, and you'll need some anti-air, which is why you'll see Arclight Phoenix, Arclight Mustang, and something like Wraith Wasp. Alright, moving on to the air giants, we first have the Raiden. Now the Raiden is very good against mid-sized units, and it's kind of a DPS option, which means that it needs some chaff clear and maybe some frontline. So some good pairings here could be the Hounds, could be the Fire Badgers, the Spiders, the Typhoons, Arclight Mustang, or even something like Sledgehammer Mustang. And then we have its bigger brother, the Overlord. This guy is a little bit heavier on the DPS side of things, but its pairings will be very similar. Again, here you will see a list of things like Hound, Sledgehammer, Spider, Fire Badger, Vulcan, and Arclight Mustang. And then we go on to the biggest units in this game, the Titans, starting with the War Factory. Now, Factory is a pretty self-sufficient unit depending on the techs you run. It can even produce things like Phoenixes, but it is not the best at chaff clearing, and sometimes it can be nice to have a little bit of bonus anti-air. So that gets reflected in its pairings with things like Mustang, Arclight Marksman Storm, Fire Badger Phoenix, or something like Arc Phoenix and Storm. As for the Flying Titan, the Abyss is a DPS unit at heart. It is very, very bad against chaff, but it does have the option to spawn something like a Wraith, so again, it can be relatively self-sufficient. Chaff will obviously be important like in all of the other comps, but you might want to pair it with some chaff clear from the get-go. Something like Sledgehammer Wraith, something like Fire Badger, Hound, or Spider. This brings us to the final 3 units that we're going to be going over, which are currently the rare units. Now, Fire Badger is the 200 cost rare unit, which is a chaff clear unit, and it needs some DPS. So the pairings obviously will be some DPS units like Phoenix, Overlord, Melter, Raiden, Abyss, or perhaps Void Eye if you go for that aerial mode on those Void Eyes. Moving on to the Typhoon, a 300 cost chaff clear anti-air unit, can use some DPS as well. And so it pairs well with things like Overlord, Phoenix, Raiden, Steelball, and Abyss. And then we have the very final unit in our list, the Farseer. Now the Farseer is a bit of an odd one. I almost didn't want to include it because it is a support vehicle that you probably shouldn't be relying on, but it is good into almost any board. I said to myself though, if you would want to make this guy work, it is probably more on the DPS side of things. And so it can use some additional chaff clear, something like Sledgehammer, Badger, Spider, Arclight Storm, or Vulcan Storm could work. Alright, that is the very end of this video. If you liked it, please leave a thumbs up. Let me know down below what you thought of these. Did I miss anything? Do you have any questions? I will try and read and answer as much as I can. With that being said, if you want to stay up to date with my latest content, please consider subscribing. And if you want to see me play live, check me out on Twitch. With that being said, take care guys, and see you in the next video. Bye bye.